I feel really privileged to have you here. Welcome to my YouTube channel, to my audience. I'm pretty sure that everyone will be really, really happy to could hear what you can say, especially in the context of your book that I really, really enjoyed. It helped me to get much deeper understanding of the things that I was discovering over years, mainly maybe also while working with my mind patterns, but also during meditation. So yeah, I found it really beneficial. And you mentioned when we were talking that this book, your book, is going to be published in Polish very soon. Is that right?
Yeah, it's in the works right now. A publisher is doing the translation, so it should be out soon. Great.
So could you please say something about yourself? I can introduce you, but maybe it would be really nice if you could say a few words about who you are, where you work. And
yeah, so I have been a college professor now my whole life. I started off in psychology, and then I kind of shifted a little bit more towards neuroscience and finished my PhD with a focus on the left and right sides of the brain. And that was a very interesting area because it got too popular. So the left and right sides of the brain became very popular, and people picked up on these ideas about the left and right sides of the brain. Then all of a sudden it started being a myth, and people would say, well, there's no, it's just the all myth thing. There's nothing to the left and right sides of the brain. And then really just in the last few years, people have re-examined that and said, well, if you look anatomically, one of the most basic things about the brain itself is that it's obviously split into a left and a right half, to the extent that they even have their own blood supply. So nature had gone through a lot of trouble to create two separate processing systems and then connect them. And so, but then on a personal level, the whole time I was going through this, I was also dealing with a lot of anxiety and a lot of neurosis. It was so bad that every day was continuously filled with this panic, anxiety. And I had realized that the neuroscience was really important, but it just wasn't doing the trick. And so I turned to the East and I started studying Buddhism, Taoism, Hinduism, and I started practices of meditation. And then all of a sudden we were in the middle of the Dalai Lama talking with neuroscientists, and all of a sudden, neuroscience and Buddhism in particular discovered they had so much in common. And it wasn't the kind of thing that would have been obvious 20 years ago, at least not in the lab I was working in. But now it just seems to be almost mainstream, where people are studying Buddhism. I teach classes in meditation. And so you can go to university and then take a class on mindfulness now.
Exactly. And it's very good, I think. And I would like to maybe now at this point, because we didn't really say, what is the title of your book? And the title is connected to what you just said. So it's No Self, No Problem, How Neuropsychology is Catching Up to Buddhism. And this second part of the title of your book, it was really something that caught me when I saw it somewhere, I think like somewhere by accident. I just saw it on internet. And when I read this part, I just immediately bought the book. And I just felt like such a great connection, how neuropsychology is catching up to Buddhism. And this book really never in any part let me down. You really provide what you promised in this title. Literally, Chris, like every chapter, every page, I found so valuable. And when I was preparing for this conversation, I was thinking how we can introduce all of it. It's not possible. You need to guys really read this book, especially when it will be published in Polish. But is it okay with you if I could just read a little paragraph, but it won't be basically from your book, but I think it will be nice introduction to what I'd like to talk to you about. Is it okay with you?
Absolutely, sure.
Okay. And I won't tell you where is this from, but it's maybe you will guess. I hope you will. Okay. I lost my balance and I looked down at my arm and I realized I can no longer identify the boundaries of my body. And I can't define where I begin and where I am because the atoms and molecules of my arm are blended with the atoms and molecules with the wall. And all I can detect is this energy. And in that moment, my brain shut and my left hemisphere went totally silent, just like someone took the remote control and pushed the mute button, total silence. And at first I was shocked to find myself in silence, but then I was immediately captivated by the magnificence of the energy around me. And because I could no longer identify the boundaries of my body, I felt enormous and expansive. Just like Genie liberated from her lamp, and my spirit felt free like a great whale swimming through the sea in silent euphoria. Nirvana, I found Nirvana, but then I realized I'm still alive and I found Nirvana. And if I found Nirvana and I'm still alive, then anyone can find Nirvana. Do you know what it is? Do you know whose experience it is?
I think that's Jill Bolte Taylor, isn't it?
Yes, yes. It's like I just wrote while she was talking that famous TED talk that she gave. Yeah.
And she was one of the clearest examples of the connection between neuroscience and the experience of what people call enlightenment, but for some people, they don't like using that phrase. There's no mystery to it. It's just when you stop thinking. And so for her, that's what the experience was. Her left hemisphere shut down. All the language, all the inner voice, all the thoughts, the 99% of the thoughts that we have that are absolutely useless finally stopped. And suddenly it's a blissful state. It's a wonder. One of the things I spend quite a bit of time on is helping people get to that experience of not thinking. Because once you have, and it doesn't have to be a very long period, it could be just a moment. And when you have it, it's very rare that a person talks about it as negative. I've never experienced, they always say it's blissful. It's always euphoric. It's like love. And when Jill Bolte Taylor, when she continued with her description, she talked about gratitude and just feeling like just so grateful for being alive.
Yes.
And so every part of it is just wonderful.
Some people recognize this kind of experience without thoughts as not great. And I came across that as well. And I think is connected to that very basic experience that there's nothing and no one there. Do you know what I mean? When you just stop thinking, you just are, and you have that recognition that maybe most people in our culture can't put it in words, but it may feel, I think, anxious a bit. I was dealing for years with this question, and I work also with people, and they have this question: who am I? Who am I? And I feel anxious because I don't know, and I have to know, who am I? And I just feel like I can't really recognize this I, and I have to, because she knows who she is and he knows, and I should know who I am, and I don't know. And then somewhere at the end of your book, there is beautiful statement, I won't quote directly, but like maybe the sense of self should be more accurately described by verbs, not nouns. So could you explore a bit this with me now?
We got a name, and then then we have an age and a gender, and this kind of identity just gets pushed on us. And so we self-define in terms of mostly our social roles. And when people start exploring, that's such a that's such a basic question. Who am I? And if you get on that path and you start exploring, and so the social constructs start to come away pretty easily. And in particular, when you tie those to the left brain and how it categorizes, and that's what thinking is to categorize and use language. And when you start exploring that, you realize that none of it's you. None of the things that you thought were who you are who you are at all. And you realize that even your thoughts aren't your own. All the stuff that goes on in your head, none of it's yours. It's a reflection of your culture. It's a reflection of the neuromachinery that is geared around survival from our past, our very distant past, when our environment was completely different. And so when you start taking those layers and you realize one at a time, and all of a sudden all the social roles are gone, then it can be a very interesting sensation, because you say, well, who am I? And you get a completely different response. I'm not Chris, I'm not 54, I'm not a college. I do these things, but you realize that the self, even as we're talking right now, there's a continuous construction of the self. And even so right now, I'm like, and this is one of the positive things about the mind. It allows us to communicate right now. But then you say, well, is that really who I am? And then once you get to a point that you've taken all the social constructs away, all the imaginary fictions that the left brain in particular has created, you realize you're left with a mystery. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting too, because I think you put it really well. Sometimes that can be a little bit shaky. You're like, who am I? And then to be comfortable with that is something that at first it might seem a little bit anxious, but I think you can transcend that, and it can become a really beautiful thing.
And relief, even relief, because then it's like, I discovered at some point that I can't know self. I can experience it, or I can allow it to be, I can allow it to appear. And it's like that now, but also maybe not so much in English. English is just my second language, but when I speak in Polish and I'm preparing, for example, I have like some workshop, whatever, and I'm preparing. And then when it's happening, I try to allow it happens. So I catch myself very often that I'm talking and I don't know what I'm talking. Do you know what I mean? It's like, it's talking itself, really. It's really doing itself then.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. In fact, in my second, I have another book coming out soon, and it's actually
great.
It's all about exercises. And one of the exercises is very similar to what you're talking about. It's like right now, I actually don't know what I'm going to say.
Yeah, exactly.
So the self is this it's totally fine to work on its own. Yeah. And so, but one of the things that we can trip ourselves up with is when we start thinking too much. Yes. And so if I start wondering like, okay, what am I going to say? And then that's another thought. And it's like, you start like, how it is if you're about to make the winning point in sports. Yes. And then all of a sudden your thoughts start going, if I don't make this point, then we lose the game. Mm-hmm. And then all of a sudden you don't make it. And it's something you could have done in your sleep. And so it's a very interesting practice to watch to see how much you can do without thinking. Mm-hmm. It's kind of it's a remarkable thing that you can get through so much of your day just by, again, shifting it from this solid noun to realizing that it's more verb-like, it's more of a continuous process. And it's just like nature. I don't have to think about nature for it to happen. The trees grow, the grass grows, And they do all of this perfectly without thought. Yeah. And as human beings, we can actually learn a lot about that process. Yeah. And not very much of it requires thinking. It just happens.
Yeah. You know? And what I found really beneficial, I don't know, it should be different word, but nothing else coming to my mind now, better word for this, was this, how you described that we mislead thinking. And I knew that before, but the way you put it, the way you explained it, I had the feeling that anyone can understand that, how much we mislead thinking with the reality. And you gave that example with map, and it's great. And you also gave these examples with this thinking constructs, like for example, mammals. And when you put nothing like mammals exist, I felt like I got enlightenment again. You know, it's like, yeah, this is not existing.
That's the taking away. That's the slow process of stripping thought that we typically think is reality and realizing it's just my thought. But that's the world so many people live in. I mean, they go to work and they'll just be in a building with a bunch of other people, but they call it work and they call it this company. And then all of a sudden it takes a seriousness to it, like this company is real. But the reality is literally just in your head. It's not like, so, and then that happens with countries, it happens with, so the mind has drawn these imaginary borders and then people buy into it. In the same way, like if you ask me like, you know, who, and I said, well, I'm Chris. I mean, that works. There's a certain level that's really useful, as long as I don't really believe it, as long as I don't really buy into it. And so all of these things the left brain does in terms of categories is the construction of categories is probably the main way that we think. And it's part of the illusion of how thoughts
and part of the suffering, I would also say. Because if we put our experience, every experience of our life, everything in categories are working by comparison, and this is connected always with adding value or taking off value. So we all the time on this, like, am I getting a bit of value or am I losing already? And who I am comparing to, and my life, myself, how I look like, how I do something, and all the time like that, isn't it?
Think about a simple thing that many people struggle with. They think by a certain age, I have to make a certain amount of money to be successful. And then you can take every single part of that and take it and say, it's all just a thought. It's just an exercise in categorization. And then you've got judgment in there. And so you may do very well with this. And you say, well, I am successful because I'm making more money at this particular age. But that's also just a thought in your head. There's no reality to it. And again, for some people that will work, but then they may later on detect that that's just a thought. And then they realize that they were just living in this thought created reality. But you're right. So much of that causes the suffering, because the problem on the other side is, well, I'm not making enough money, so therefore I'm not successful, or I don't look a certain way, or I'm too old. All those categorizations that we assume are actual reflections of reality are just in our head. And so that's, when you could almost retitle this and say, like, no mind, no problem, or no thinking, no problem.
Yeah.
And so,
but don't you think that it's also the problem of, and some spiritual teachers are saying about it, pointing it, that we don't want to let go of this thinking. Like, we are addicted to this thinking. I remember years ago when I came across meditation, I didn't know what it is. I started exploring and I found somewhere like, just try not to think intentionally. Obviously there will be this thoughts coming from behind, like here and then all the time, but just intentionally. And I was cooking, doing something, and I was trying to do this practice, and I found it really difficult, not only because it's difficult to do, but also because I found myself like in this, like, so what now? Like, it's boring. You know, we just feel like it's something really important happening here, and without this is just, you know, not enough. And I think this is a big illusion, and illusion is a word that's showing up in your book quite often. I would like you to also maybe say something about this.
You said it perfectly. Thinking is an addiction. But the interesting thing about the thinking addiction, so if you drink or use drugs, it's more obvious to you that you have a problem. And like, you know, yeah. I mean, you're the one, there's the drugs, or you're drinking, or whatever the addiction is. With thinking, there's a certain transparency to thought. We don't recognize it as thought because we see it as reality. So it's a really difficult problem. It's a difficult addiction to become aware of.
Yes.
And so because, you know, you're so convinced that your work problems are real, and you're absolutely convinced that your work problems are real, or you don't have enough money. And this is a fascinating thing, because you can go to some of the richest places in the world, and the same person who is more wealthy than any human being, and historically speaking, they might be in the top 5% of all humans who have ever lived with money, and they may be totally convinced that they have a money problem. And the trick of it is they really think it's a money problem. They don't get that it's a thinking problem.
Yes. In the end, no matter what kind of house you have, like maybe worth £1 million or only £100,000, but you just sit in this room with this.
Yeah.
That.
Most people have more than they need, but it's the thinking mind and the addiction. And this is one of the things that I talk about in my next book, because people say, well, where did the mind come from? Well, I go back historically into evolution and say that the mind was a great survival tool. This need for more, this desire that the Buddha was talking about that causes suffering, that's part of the mind program. And it helped us. 70, 80,000 years ago in evolution, it helped us survive. But the problem is we don't need it anymore. We simply don't need this program. We don't need the desire for more. And, but talking about thinking as an addiction, even that rush that you get, and you can get it in a couple of different ways. You can get it when you buy something, but you also get it when you're right. So being in academia, being a professor, we've spent a lot of time with this game. It's a thinking game where I'm trying to be right. And when you're right, it can actually feel like you get a dopamine, that neurotransmitter of pleasure. You get a dopamine rush when you're right. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the reasons the addiction stays around, because even though it may keep me up at night, so I'm trying to sleep and everything is fine, but I'm laying in bed and my thoughts are racing. But then the next day I go to work or I'm on social media and I'm in a debate and I really get someone and I'm right. And I feel so good. You're right. that keeps the addiction alive. Yeah. And we will go through so much suffering to be for those moments of being right. That's why thoughts are very difficult to give up, because there's a chance not just for me to be right, but there's a chance I could be, like in that whole game, we're playing a game of survival that's again, hundreds of thousands of years old. But it helped us survive, but we don't need it anymore. I don't need to compete with you. And that's one of the wonderful things that I enjoy doing these podcasts, because like right now, we're not debating. You're not trying to be right. I'm not trying to be right. It's a really different mode of communicating. One of my favorite quotes is from one of the first millionaires here in the United States, Rockefeller. And someone had asked him, they said, how much money will be enough for you? And I think his answer was beautiful. He said, just a little bit more than I have.
Always. Always. Yeah.
But we look at this as material things. But the interesting thing about all that is it's really a thought addiction. So the quest for more things is really when you get caught up in thought. And because the thought and the mind are always going to want more, they are so at odds with reality that reality is never good enough. And that's why the present moment, this moment that really is the only thing that has any reality to it, almost never gets experienced for the person who is continuously in thought.
Mm-hmm.
And I had wonderful time with my daughter where I would, she'd say, "Dad, what time is it?" And I'd say, "It's now." And she'd look at me and I'd say, and I'm like, "It's still now. It's always now. It's never not now." And she'd get this look like, it's almost like an epiphany.
How old she was then?
She was very young, maybe 10.
Oh, okay.
You know? But she would get this, she would experience the now. And for so many thinkers, the now is something that is very strange. They've never experienced it. They spend so much time thinking about either the future or reliving something in the past that it's literally like an epiphany. It's like the first taste of reality people get when they wake up to this present moment. And the wonderful thing about the present moment, like when all the thoughts subside and you're finally in the present moment, that's when you get that sensation that there's nothing needs to be done. There's no place to go. You don't have to do anything. Everything is just perfect. Everything is fit together just as it should. And that's a wonderful feeling. Now, again, that feeling wouldn't have done our ancestors very much in terms of survival. I mean, but we don't need that anymore. We don't need that neuromechanisms for survival. It's outdated. We've got, I mean, what are we doing on the planet? I mean, how much do we need? I mean, how, when is that sort of, how many cars will be enough? How many, what, I mean, and it happens the moment you stop thinking. The moment you stop thinking, that's when everything shifts and you realize that things are absolutely fine and I don't need to do anything.
Maybe it's also about, it's so hard to let go of this thoughts because we tend to identify with this thinking process that I'm thinking these thoughts. I'm the author of these thoughts. And they are mine and they are so important. And yeah, they are just very crucial to my existence. And I have to think them all the time. Because it maybe also because when I don't think, I don't have anything else to identify with. So if I don't have this experience, for example, that, like you said, it became lately so popular, luckily, like meditation. And if person doesn't have this experience, for example, of meditation and never connected to anything else within himself, herself, then only thinking process left to be identified with, So how much misleading and how big illusion it is.
I was put in that position for a long time early in my life where I wouldn't have any clue who I was without my thoughts. And then so when you talk about being identified with your thoughts, that's a very common mode for most people. And so that's the really interesting thing that happens when people stop thinking. And, there's that, it shakes up everything. And all of a sudden there's that feeling like maybe I don't know who I am because, all of a sudden that's what the self, that's what I talked about in the book, that the self is nothing more than a thought. It's a thought about, your thinking. And so, like I said, the self is a lot more like a verb. You construct selves for different things, for different events in your life. You may put on a self. Selves are like clothes, you can change them. And like I said, there's a certain utility, usefulness to all that, but like to be identified with that process is very, probably one of the main sources of suffering, because in our past in particular, we were geared towards focusing on the negative. And a lot of psychological research shows this, that there's a bias in that mind program where we will focus on the negative, and that was really useful 100,000 years ago. It serves us absolutely no purpose right now to focus. And you could see a certain shift where human beings are beginning to recognize that not only am I not my thoughts, but I actually have a little bit of say in what I attend to. And so maybe I do have a bunch of really negative thoughts and it's stressing me out. And there's a really simple technique called grounding. I don't know if you've heard of it before.
Mm-hmm.
But in grounding,
you can say that about it.
Yeah, you instead of thinking, you bring yourself back to reality, and you focus on 5 things you can see, 5 things you can hear, 5 things that you can touch. And the fascinating thing about this is that goes back to a philosopher, Alan Watts, who started to bring notions of Buddhism. He's one of the first people to bring the idea of Buddhism to the United States, and he once said everyone should stop thinking at least once a day and come to your senses. And that's, and all of a sudden when you focus on the senses, and that's, again, it's a nice way to get out of your thinking mind. It's a nice way to wake up to the present moment instead of having all the racing thoughts that so many of us have.
Mm-hmm. And also I just really exploring parts of my mind. I discovered that nearly every time when I feel something, especially when it's difficult feeling like anger, sadness, feeling hurt, stuff like that. And when I started very in a committed way checking that with myself, and I always found there was a very specific thought before, preceding this feeling, and I even called it the thoughts of meaning, because I just realized when this happens, I feel this because I have a thought that this means, and that meaning, and that meaning I realized that it's always about me. So for example, he did this because that means that he wanted to ignore me, or that means that he rejected me. And when I checked that again, okay, what else maybe this situation means? And it turned out that it's something about this person. It doesn't mean anything about me, but I just really realized this automatic, very strong action of maybe my left brain to create that meaning where it doesn't exist really. And my emotional reaction is really to that meaning that my brain is making up. It's really tiring.
Yeah, that's a really nice way to put it, in terms of we think so much that for most people, we don't even recognize how much our thinking is influencing our feelings. And so much of our feelings are the direct result of a certain way of thinking. Yeah. And there's even a lot of research that will show that the particular thoughts that we have can determine and influence the type of feelings that we have. Now, the really interesting thing, and you describe this really well, that when you start to recognize your thoughts, and you become the witness to your thoughts. So instead of identifying with them, you start to observe them. And then you start to recognize how those thoughts are directing certain emotions that you're having. And so when you get to the source, you start to recognize that if you change your thoughts, actually you don't even have to change them. You simply have to recognize them. And when you recognize them and the influence they have over your feelings, it's like everything takes it shifts quite so much that the way I put it is you simply don't trust your thoughts anymore. It just simply means that thoughts have kind of burned themselves out in terms of being authentic. And so, yeah, so you may still have these thoughts. Oh, I'm not good enough, or I don't make enough, or but they may still be there. Now, some people describe those thoughts and they say that they really turn down to the point of being off. Some people describe it that way, but it doesn't have to be turned off. The only thing you need is a little bit of skepticism, you know, the question, like the authentic, how authentic is that thought? Is it real? Is it valid? Is it really describing reality, or is it just something in my skull, in my left brain, that's, you know, reaching for a story, so it can cling to a story, so it feels like it holds on to a truth, and that is satisfying to the left brain. So the left brain feels satisfied that it knows it has an explanation, it has an interpretation, and to recognize the interpreter. I mean, so much of the book is just about that we have this program, and it's in language in the left brain, and it's always on, and you know, you may be walking down a hallway and someone's laughing, and the left brain turns on and says, "Are they laughing at me?
Yeah.
What did I do to make that person laugh?"
Yeah.
And so it's all tied in with judgment, and it's tied in with thinking, and all of that is really together in this one package we call mind. And we're at a very interesting time in human history where we're starting to recognize the mind program. We're recognizing that it's not who we are, you know?
Yeah, so what is recognizing that then? What is within us is recognizing that, because we have that left side of the brain, which you call interpreter, which is great. And then there is some, and it's very categorical, judgmental, descriptive, by using only some like specific feature and qualities of the reality. And there is something else, some different perspective that we can maybe get to. So what is
it's a wonderful question. What is, so you start to observe your thoughts, and maybe you're not even thinking anymore, and you're not identified with your thoughts, and you say, okay, well, what is it that's actually doing the observing?
Yeah.
And that, if there's a huge quest for trying to figure out what consciousness is at this moment, and you find some people who are completely into the idea that the brain gives rise to consciousness. But there's some very interesting alternatives, that maybe consciousness is fundamental. Maybe consciousness is maybe just one. In other words, maybe it's not your consciousness and it's not my consciousness. There's just consciousness. And that, and the interesting thing about consciousness is, you see, there's a certain arrogance to the thinking mind. It assumes that everything in the universe is thinkable, and I can figure it out if I just think about it long enough. I think Einstein put it that way. It's like the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible. But that may not be true. Maybe our thinking mind is limited. Maybe consciousness can't be thought about. So, like the way you put it, you said, well, what's doing the observing? What if what's doing the observing is simply beyond thinking?
Mm-hmm.
What if the thing we talk about consciousness, what if it's simply one of these things that is so beyond the limitations of the thinking mind, that whatever consciousness is, what if it's beyond our ability to think about? And it turns out there's all kinds of things like this that we can't, the thinking mind simply can't understand. Something as simple as humor, like what makes people laugh.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we don't know. Laughing is like comedians try to get that's their job, to make people laugh, and they kind of do it, obviously, but when they have to articulate it and they say, well, what's funny? They have a hard time doing it because there's certain things that we simply can't think about.
It's just happening, but we can't explain it, the mechanism or something. Yeah, like
it's just one of there are mysteries out there. Humor, consciousness may be an absolute mystery. And the thinking mind, the left brain, does not want to accept that. The thinking mind says, no, I can figure it out. As long as I think hard enough about it, I will figure it out.
Yeah, that's why I think we compulsively ruminating and just something happened at work, or like, I don't know, in a relationship, and we think and think and think, and maybe with this like urge that ultimately I will figure it out, like you said.
Well, how many of your listeners would like agree to that statement, that as long as I put enough time into thinking, eventually I will figure my life out? And that's part of the addiction of thinking, that we're convinced that it's a big problem. And if we think about it long, and one of the things we don't get about the thinking process, because again, thinking is it's a tricky business, is that thinking doesn't just find problems and solve problems, it also creates problems. And some very interesting research on this will show it, like they'll give people a very simple task, like every time you see a blue dot, press a button. And so they'll have all these other colored dots, and people are pretty good at this. They'll press every time a blue dot comes up. But then the researchers did something very clever. They started taking the blue dots away. And you think people would say, okay, well, if you take them away, then I'll just stop responding. But what people did is they redefined what a blue dot was. They changed the definition. So now if it was even kind of purple, they'd say, okay, well, then I'll press a button for that. And so that's the thing with thinking. There's never an end to it, because every time we solve one problem, I promise every time you solve a thinking problem, there's another problem waiting to be thought about.